This patch is bonkers. There's a ton of changes. Some of them are very weird. Let's take a look at what's about to change in Marvel Snap. First, and perhaps most controversial, Storm is going to 4-5, no longer a 3-2. There were three major targets that could be hit to hit the major Storm, War Machine, Legion combo decks. These have been a big part of the metagame that we've had recently, and probably most players, I think, would say, on balance, that they are their least favorite part of this metagame. Are they the strongest deck in the game? I don't believe so. I personally believe those to be Agent Venom decks. However, the key difference between Agent Venom decks and these decks is that Agent Venom decks are playing normal Marvel Snap, where both of you play cards. The Storm War Machine Legion decks were not playing cards. I have no objection to the goal of removing a deck that was entirely dependent on preventing your opponent from actually being able to play the game. That is a fine goal to me. If there is an objection to be voiced here, however, I do believe that it would be made in the context of, did it have to be Storm? Remember, this is a 3-card combo. Storm, War Machine, and Legion all could have been reasonable targets. Of the two that were not hit, I personally believe that many people will be surprised that Legion was not nerfed, maybe making it a 6-cost card. Here's the thing, though. I think that's about as bad as what they did with this. Like, this is a situation where there aren't a lot of good answers, basically. You could go back and revert War Machine and remove the combo that way. You could make Legion a fairly unworkable 6-cost, because honestly, the point of that card is to do that on turn 5, giving you a turn to actually adjust to the new battlefield locations. Or you could do what they did here and make Storm a 4-cost and make the combo a lot less 1, 2, 3 plug and play. I don't necessarily think this was the only solution, however. I would propose maybe that the right option for a combo like this was not to make it so that it no longer existed, but to make the downside more prominent. After all, there are many decks in Marvel Snap that have very powerful outputs of points that can effectively invalidate the other person's cards being played. And while many may argue that that's sort of similar to this, I think, there is a degree to which that is acceptable. What I'm wondering is what the proper amount of sacrifice you need to be making in deck building is in order to justify this combo existing. Basically, when you look at something like Mr. Negative, is Mr. Negative into Jane Foster really all that different than what this combo was? I'm tempted to say the answer is basically no. Mr. Negative into Jane Foster has the same wholly invalidating impact on your opponent. It's not as guaranteed, but it's the same kind of thing. The reason that that's balanced, of course, is A, Mr. Negative is a 4-1, right? Is there a number that they could have put War Machine to that made this combo less splashable? Part of what makes this combo so strong is that it was able to go into various mid-range decks. Move mid-range and, the other move mid-range, the anti-move Scream mid-range, were the typical decks that were playing it, and that is part of the power of this combo. I would have aimed to hit that before changing a card like Storm, personally. I like Storm as a 3-2. I think that is a cool thing for her to be. I think that this is not maybe an incredibly significant misstep, but I would have investigated something like 4-4 War Machine. Let's see if we can allow the dream of this combo to exist while removing it from being an easily splashable card in all of these decks, because it is just a genuinely decent card to play a lot of the time. Maybe punish that aspect of it. Punish the fact that Storm would be a 3-2. This would be a 4-4. Legion, maybe take a point off that. I think you could do it. I really do. And I feel like this decision to go directly at the combo by making Storm into this it's not the worst decision. It does make the card a different card entirely, a more interesting, perhaps, and more diverse card. Turn 5, having the ability to play 5 drops onto this is interesting, but the problem you have is that if you are not actually... The issue about a turn 4-5 being, I'm going to win one location, is that when you are able to do that, you also really need to have something big enough to win another location. And that's kind of the issue. If you want to spend your entire turn 4 and then your entire turn 5 focusing on one location, your opponent, will feel pretty good about you doing that, assuming I can reasonably target the other two. I personally think that I have a little less hope for Storm with these stats at this cost. Rock Slide is a very interesting card to nerf, and frankly, if I were involved in this, it would not have been a card that I targeted. In the patch notes, they specifically noted that they felt as though Darkhawk had just been too good for too long, and I feel like there's a lot of that they've said before, basically. Darkhawk was, according to their metrics, an incredibly high-performing card when they nerfed it the first time and then the second time, and that wasn't necessarily borne out in terms of either play rate or any of the data we could track on the public trackers at the higher ends of the game. So I am left to assume that basically Darkhawk is like this just generally decent, easy-to-play deck that kind of crushes at low ranks that make up the bulk of their data and are where the bulk of their balancing decisions are aimed. When I look at a decision like this that is so drastically different from the one I would have made, I am reasonable enough to assume maybe I'm wrong. It's possible that I'm totally whiffing on the idea that this version of the deck is actually very good. But to me, and I think, this is borne out by data on public trackers, this is borne out by a bunch of stuff, the version of the Agent Venom deck without Darkhawk and this package in it is much, much stronger. And I don't understand why they're targeting this specifically in an attempt to get it out of that deck. I realize there is another nerf happening to another portion of the other version of the AV deck. We'll get to that later. But it is, I think, maybe just a consequence of the fact that it is much harder to nerf the AV Iron Man deck. That's just a much more difficult thing to come up with. Assuming it needs a nerf, there is some text that indicated it doesn't, according to their balance metrics, which, again, not party to that. But the fact that they would nerf the Darkhawk one and not what I would consider, what most people would consider, I think reasonably considered the best deck in the game, is a little bit striking to me. And I am confident enough in that prognosis, enough of my very good at the game friends agree with me, enough of my even not so very good at the game friends agree with me. Like, it's the best deck in the game, and they're hitting the bad version of it. And I generally don't understand it, and this is one of the more perplexing choices that they've made here. In terms of impact to the Darkhawk package, maybe they weren't even trying to hit that deck at all. Maybe the Phoenix Force Black Widow Misery deck was just so annoying that they didn't want it to be part of the game anymore. Who knows? Maybe they were just sick of Darkhawk and this rock package being a thing in the context of talking about stuff that prevents you from playing the game. The text in the announcement does indicate that it does seem to be something along those lines, a sort of a part of a great cleansing of stuff that sucks. But I don't know where you draw that line. Where do you draw the line on stuff that prevents people from doing stuff? At what point is that an appropriate part of your game? And at what point is it not an appropriate part of your game? And I think they are trying to make a statement here. That's what this feels like to me. Here's where we get actually crazy. This is one of the best cards in the game, and it is getting a buff. And I think in the notes, they sort of allude to the fact that they kind of are aware of this, like this is a very good card, but they also, in the Shadow King notes, specifically allude to the idea that Agent Venom decks are extremely good, but not necessarily nerfable, and they wanted to try a softer way of increasing the ability to counterplay them. And I think, first things first, a lot of people are going to see this in my comments, but hopefully more prominently in comments that are not mine, because I try to give the benefit of the doubt on this kind of stuff when I can. A lot of people are going to see this and say, yeah, okay, they're just going to nerf Agent Venom in 4 weeks anyway. They're only not doing it because it's on the Season Pass. And to those people, I would say, Elsa did get nerfed on the Season Pass. There has been precedent for that happening. I don't assume that they're lying about the balance metrics, but what I will say is that what is okay for a balance metric, like let's say this is the best deck in the game, but it's not exceeding their balance metrics, that might be fine for right now. But in 4 weeks or in 6 weeks, if nothing has changed, they have demonstrated a willingness to just hit stuff in the order to promote change in the metagame. So what is okay in terms of margins for these decks right now might not be okay in terms of margins for these decks in the future. So if someone were to ask me, Do you think Agent Venom will be nerfed eventually? I think my answer would still probably be yes. I do think that would happen. I personally would do it. But I also understand the strategy here, which is to say, what if we don't have to do that? What if we actually are able to leave Agent Venom the way that he is? And the thing that would prompt that not happening would be Agent Venom decks stay at the same rate. They're still just as good. They're immediately incredible, and they remain that way for an extended period of time. I think if that kind of stuff happens, they have demonstrated that they're willing to hit stuff, even if it's not necessarily exceeding their balance thresholds, if something is consistently maybe the best deck in the game or very close to it, which I believe the AV Iron Man decks basically are, and the AV Bounce decks basically are. I also think that it's possible that Agent Venom is getting a bit of a longer leash, because he is notably not doing any of the stuff that people really hate when it happens to them in Marvel Snap. He's just a good card with good stats, and we've suffered through those before, right? We all thought Thena would get nerfed, and it turns out she only needed to lose 1 point of power. So there's no point necessarily in overreacting to Agent Venom right now, but they can try to pump power into strategies that are able to counter him. Here's the thing. I don't think this does this. I mean, obviously, Shadow King is good against Agent Venom, but when you look at what the best Agent Venom decks are doing, AV Iron Man kind of stuff, that deck plays Cosmo. And it's like there's a hard cap on the amount of good an on-reveal card can be if you are trying to beat the AV Iron Man deck. Shadow King is already a card that every deck trying to beat that deck is playing. And I don't think this does anything to that. Like, we're already playing Shadow King if we're trying to beat that deck. We're already playing Shadow King and like a US Agent or a Super Skrull, because that's what it takes. And buffing Shadow King to create counterplay for Agent Venom Iron Man specifically, I don't really buy that, because when you look at the other Agent Venom decks, it's like, okay, outside of AV Iron Man, they hit AV Darkhawk by making Rock Slide a 4 or 5. I don't know if that's even going to exist anymore. I kind of doubt it. And then you look at stuff like AV Bounce, AV Sarah. All of those decks are playing this card. It's not even a nerf to them. And so you have one sector of the Agent Venom metagame that is already prepared to deal with this card existing a lot. And then another sector of the Agent Venom metagame that is just using this card. And so I started thinking, what would I have done if I were them? And my goal was, say, let's make some more counterplay to Agent Venom. And I kind of got nowhere. Like, buff Super Skrull, buff, yeah, like, I genuinely did kind of get nowhere with it. I really tanked on it for a while. One of the ideas I threw up on the board during 8 cubes was, what if we just, like, redistributed some claw power? So, like, claw went to, like, 5-6 plus 6 instead of 5-4 plus 8, and it just made it harder for them to have 2 good Mystique targets in the deck. But I don't really think that would do much. That said, I do think it'd probably do more than this, because half the AV decks already play this card. The other half are playing Cosmo to beat this card. It just feels a little baffling to me. It's possible that I'm just way off base, and the dynamics I'm talking about are purely limited to, like, high-level play, and don't really trickle down to the larger pieces of the metagame. And again, I think that happens a lot. I think there's a decent amount where it's just, they're not really aiming these changes at me. They're not really aiming these changes at people like me. They're not really aiming these changes at people who are way up there at the top of Infinite. They're aiming these changes at everyone else. And I wonder if it's possible that that is a meaningful change for everyone else. I really do think that of all the changes they've made in this patch, this is the one that makes me get like a little question mark above my head the way an NPC in a video game would. Electro getting a 1-point buff, I think, is probably long overdue. It's not the kind of change that's, like, mandatory, but it's a great change to just do stuff like this and demonstrate that, like, look, hey, we are not totally abandoning every old card. We are going to start to, like, buff them up a little bit more over time and see what happens there. I personally think that Electro has been sort of vastly overshadowed by every other card that is in a similar lane. But I do still see people playing him, mostly in the context of Blink, and nothing will change about that. Him being a 3-3, I think mostly doesn't change anything for the card. This is the closest to a nothing buff that we've ever seen. Most Electro decks are either Blink decks or Misery decks that are looking to obviate his existence on the board in the first place, so you aren't really going to get a lot out of him being an extra point of power, even less than an extra point of power on most other cards. And an extra point of power we've seen in the past has mattered, but I think it matters a lot less in the context of everyone is getting rid of this guy. Speaking of Misery, she is getting her 1-point buff to 4-8, which I think is about all right. What I'm a little frustrated by here with the Rock Slide change is I think they took the best Misery deck, and I'm not saying they made it unplayable, but they made it a lot worse, I think. And I'm really interested to see what happens with this deck going forward. That deck, of course, is the Phoenix Force Misery deck. That Phoenix Force Misery deck was a Rocks and Hawks deck. You would play Rock Slide and Korg. You would trigger them multiple times with Misery. This would make your Darkhawk enormous and gigantic. You are gonna have a lot of a harder time doing that when Rock Slide costs 4. The general curve that you wanted to have that was super busted with that deck was Black Widow stuff. Like, I'm not gonna sit here and argue that. I don't think it's gonna die and go away. But having that hit to Rock Slide going to 4 is meaningful, I think. I wonder if this deck will be able to survive it. I think that is one of my big questions for the upcoming post-patch metagame is what the hell happens to the Darkhawk PF deck? Because I personally worry about the curve. Do we have to give up on Phoenix Force? That gives up our incredible line of, like, multiple playing 3 Black Widows per game. I don't want to give up that line. Why would I want to give up that line? I want Phoenix Force in the deck. Do we just accept it? Do we run the same 12 cards and just say, look, it's just, we're going to be a little bit worse, but also we got our 1 point extra on Misery, so maybe we'll be a little bit better and it'll balance out? Does the fact that that Rock Slide is now a 4/5 mean that that kind of meaningful body might be a little bit more helpful in a deck that often lacked power? Will it turn out that I'm wrong and it's actually a buff because of the additional substance to Misery and Rock Slide? I don't know. I'm really fascinated to find out. I don't like losing out on that Rock Slide into Misery option, but it was very clearly like the third best plan you had. All your other plans involving Misery were usually just like way better than Rock Sliding. So maybe it's not even that big of a problem at all. Maybe it's fine. And the fact that we have a 4/5 and a 4/8 now is actually helpful because the deck doesn't really have a lot of beef in it outside of Darkhawk and some demons anyway. So all those additional points will help us win more locations. I don't know. I really want to find out. Daredevil at 2/2 was a card that taught me a very important lesson. Well, several very important lessons, really. The first lesson is just how bad it is to be a 2/2. Like, this, one of the major reasons that it's constantly harped on that 1-drops are fairly medium in Marvel Snap is because they're not committing a lot of power to the board, and that matters not just in terms of inclusion in your deck, but inclusion on the board. After all, you're using one of your valuable 4 slots at a location on something that is almost certainly going to be smaller than what your opponent plays on 2. A 2/2, and I learned this from Daredevil as well as Loki, is the worst of both worlds. It's bad for the slot economy, it's a bad top deck late, it's hard to weave into your curve, you really want to play them on 2 a lot of the time. All those problems are worse for a 2/2 than they are for, say, a 1/2, right? And so with Daredevil, the real lesson is sometimes it's worth it to make that sacrifice, but not always, and especially not without a lot of the cards that Daredevil wants to be paired with. Daredevil is a big fan of these sort of lockdown surprise gambit type cards. There are 2 types of cards that have been good with Daredevil in the past. Professor X is one exemplar of the type, where it's just a card that allows you to instantly win a lane. And of course, Leader is an exemplar of the other type. You set up, and then you have a perfect Leader on turn 6. When now, after nerfs to both Professor X and Leader, it's possible that this is a less scary buff than people will think. I personally still consider it fairly scary. There is, I am positive, a very relevant super giant deck, and every point of power matters to a super giant deck. Super giant decks are hard to play, they're confusing, and they're difficult. But when you play a super giant on turn 4, and you have a Daredevil on the board, you see everything your opponent does, and they see nothing you do. That is an unbelievably powerful advantage when you have access to all the tricks that a super giant deck has. Whether that be Cosmoing their cool on reveal that they played on 5. Whether that be blowing up their big guy that they played on 5 with a Negasonic Teenage Warhead. Another card, actually, that just got an extra point of power only a few weeks ago. Daredevil getting a buff matters to that deck. That deck is always sort of around, but A, is very hard to play, and B, does not have a lot of raw stats in it. And so every little bit of ability to eke out a win at a location really matters to that deck. Going from 2-2 to 2-3 should matter to it. I would expect to see people playing Supergiant. I would not necessarily expect massive success from it because it is an extremely difficult deck to play. But this power of Daredevil Supergiant is relevant, is real, and I would be interested in exploring it early in the next metagame. I said that we'd get to this one, and here we are. Claw is receiving perhaps the most minor of nerfs, going from giving 8 power to going to giving 7 power. That's not nothing. Like, there are some real consequences to this, and it does hit the AV Iron Man deck, although perhaps not in the most meaningful way. I will say that that is another deck where every point of power really does matter. It all adds up into a more cohesive whole than the parts, and so Claw losing that point of power is relevant, not just because of Claw, but also because many of the times that you play the deck, you're going to be duplicating a Claw with a Mystique, and that Mystique will also lose that point of power. Of course, I don't expect much to really change. I would still expect that deck to be very good. The combination of points and interaction that it has is extremely powerful. Being a deck that has the ability to play Cosmo in a world where people are playing the newly buffed Shadow King feels like a prerequisite for anyone who wants to actually be putting green power on the board. And if you want to be putting green power on the board, that is the established best shell for it, for those reasons already discussed. I don't think losing this is going to be much of a big deal to that deck. Personally, I think this is a little bit of a nothing burger. It's not nearly as significant as the buff or the nerf to Shadow King and Rock Slide specifically, and I do think that it is also not nearly as significant, of course, as the change to Storm. If anything, actually, Claw's utility will be a little bit drained by the fact that Storm is no longer a major part of the metagame. It's not like he was incredibly useful already in those Storm War Machine Legion games, but if they stormed a location, you could Claw, and a lot of people still did that despite not really realizing that it was a pretty big misplay to do that. If you didn't have the combo, you could win those locations, and that was a powerful thing to do. I still think Claw's going to be pretty good. They mentioned that they felt not super confident about pumping power into these Series 1 cards. They felt like it was better than all of its peers, and I find that hard to argue. When you look at Claw and you look at White Tiger, it's one of them is clearly better than the other. I think that is undeniably true. When you look at Claw and other 5-drops in Series 1, yeah, okay, I get it. It's better. It's a better card. I understand that. However, I have enjoyed having this card in the meta, and I will be sad if it ends up going away. The good news is, I don't really think it will. I think this is still a perfectly functional card that does perfectly functional stuff, and I'm happy that it still is going to hopefully have a place. Finally, in my opinion, the unambiguously best change in this patch is to Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary going from affecting all locations to only affecting the location she's played at. In the notes, they name-checked Scar as a potential synergy. That was a major issue for this card in the context of it would make your 10s into 9s and they wouldn't discount Scar. Now it will not do that. I am not necessarily hopeful for this card. It's also a buff to any deck playing Sauron, because now when you're not Sauroning, Typhoid Mary is no longer still so incredibly bad. Right now, this card is actually a 4/7 at minimum, and I think that actually is quite interesting when you start really digging into it. Like, hey, wait a minute. Only the other cards at this location? So this is a 4/10, which at worst becomes a 4/7? How many decks are interested in just 4 big right now? And I think the answer might be more than you'd think, but I'm not sure exactly how many. I do think that there's some real appeal to this card. It's quite interesting, and I kind of wonder if there's actually going to be something that can be done with this card in other shells. I mean, like, you don't even necessarily have to be a Luke Cage deck, right? Like, this is just a really good 4-drop. How interested are we in that? Is it in line? And I think the other thing about this that really makes me happy is it brings this card in line with cards like Rescue, cards like Jessica Jones. One of the things that I really like about 4-drop design is that there's a lot of conditional, like 4/8s and 4/9s. And I think that that is a nice place for this card to end up, If you think of it as comparable to like Rescue and Jessica Jones, it effectively ranges from 4.7 to 4.10. So the range is actually higher. Rescue, of course, ranges up to 4.9. Jessica Jones ranges up to 4.9, but their bases are lower, right? So not only does it start higher, it also has a higher potential. And I think that's just a cool spot for this card to be in. I'm glad. I really want Typhoid Mary to actually do something for once ever. And I'm really happy, even though I do feel a little conflicted about this patch as a whole, changes like this are the kind of stuff that I crave in OTAs. So, conflicted. What exactly am I conflicted about? I think first things first, I'm a little conflicted about the choice to nerf Storm rather than the other two cards. I think that right or wrong, the perception on this will be that they chose to nerf the free card rather than the expensive one. I don't know if that's what's actually going on behind the scenes. Personally, I doubt it. I think what actually happened here is they took a too hard line approach on this combo, and they should have instead just taken some power off War Machine and made it harder to splash. And then, if that didn't work, I think you're much more justified in making the change to Storm as a card. I worry about her going forward. Shadow King, I've detailed. I don't think it'll have the effect that they want. I respect the effort, but I don't think it will accomplish their goal. That said, I can't think of anything that would accomplish their goal, so I'm probably the wrong guy to ask in the first place. And of course, Rock Slide, who I can only assume they were just like, we're sick of this guy. I got rocks in my deck one too many times. Glenn Jones played against somebody playing Darkhawk and was like, this sucks. I'm getting rid of it. That is my only possible assumption here. I don't think the deck has been all that good at high levels, and I think that if it has reached metrics representing that it could or should be a candidate for a nerf, I find that basically shocking and not necessarily hard to believe, but indicative of a larger split between high-level gameplay and low-level gameplay than I thought, and indicative of even more focus on low-level gameplay rather than high-level gameplay than I thought. And I already thought those things existed. It's just a difference of magnitude, honestly, if they're hitting a card like Rock Slide, to me. The rest of this patch, I'm actually generally happy with, especially Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary getting a buff like this is so sick. I'm actually kind of interested in her. I'm sure she'll fizzle out and it'll just be like, oh, you know, she's pretty good, but not really like one of the cards you actually want to use one of the 12 slots, 12 precious slots in your deck on. I get it. But I am happy that they do stuff like that still. That's the kind of stuff I'd like to see more of in the future. I think, ultimately, their intentions are good with this patch. The execution, I think, I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and say the execution could have been better, because, again, I don't really necessarily have any better ideas, and I feel like it would be hypocritical of me to say, you know, I don't like what you did, but also I don't really have any meaningful critique to offer on it that could convince you to do something else. I do wish it wasn't like this necessarily. They took aim in the right direction, but I'm not sure they're going to end up hitting the things they took aim at, is basically where I'm at. I would like to know what you think about that, because as always, I'm KM Best. I read all the comments. You've been phenomenal. And of course, I will see you in the next one. Let me know what you think. Have a great day.